So first I need to acknowledge that Simon Yep prepared the slides. Simon works with me on a soil CRC project. This is the Sandy Soils project. And we recently got him to give a lecture to our third year crop and pasture science students on this topic. So these were the slides that he prepared. So I've shamelessly stolen them for today. And of course, the photograph there at the center really shows water repellence in its finest, where you've got a sandy material and the water beading up and just sitting on top of it with showing no inclination whatsoever to soak into the soil. Various terms are used: water repellents, hydrophobic, non-wetting. They're referring to the same thing. And this is a phenomenon that occurs all over the world, a whole range of climates, soil types and land use types. In Western Australia, something like 10 million hectares, almost 40% of the ag area expresses water repellents to some extent. And you can see on the map on the right, this is a deep-herd product, which just shows the abundance of water repellents by region. So virtually every region has some soils with water repellents. Where it's coloured yellow, it just means that a less than a third of the landscape would be affected. When it's getting into the pink colours, it's 50%, and the more purpley colour, more than 70% of the landscape is at risk of water repellents. But of course, it doesn't occur every year or to the same extent every year. It's still a bit of a mysterious phenomenon, water repellents, being able to predict exactly where it's going to occur in a particular year and how severe it's going to be. But in general, there are estimates of 30 to 40% loss in crop and pasture production when it's at its worst, and that if you aggregate all of those potential losses, it's 200 to 300 million per year. So something that has obviously been the focus of attention in the West and increasingly in South Australia for quite some time. The reason it's problematic is mostly the effect on soil hydrology. So you just get fields like the one on the right-hand side. It's rained quite heavily. You can see the standing water on the surface, but if you take a spade and dig into it, apart from a few centimetres at the surface that have wet up, it's bone dry underneath. And that lack of infiltration can persist for hours, even days, even months. And so the lack of infiltration is obviously a major problem, but on sloping land, that excess water that's sitting on the surface may cause overland flow and erosion risk. And then if you dig into the profile, you do find on water repellent soils, it does infiltrate to some extent, but it's often through what's called finger flow. That is, you don't get complete wetting, but there will be zones of soil that wet up, and it's shown here on the photograph where a water repellent sand has had water added to the surface, mixed with a blue dye, and then after some hours or days, you dig a pit and just look at where the dye has moved into the soil as an indication of how it's wet up. And so here you can see those finger flows, but there are large areas of the upper soil that just didn't wet up at all, stayed completely dry. And something else you often see with that finger flow is, particularly if there's a clay subsoil, water will flow down one of those channels until it hits that clay layer, and then it will tend to spread out. And so you often get wetting of water repellent soils, duplex soils, from the bottom up. So as the rainy season proceeds and you get more water accumulating above the clay layer, it starts to wick up and moisten that topsoil. The channels where the water flows are often associated with old root channels, and I'll come back to that later.
Richard, can you get waterlogging in that? You know, like you're saying, it can a pool in the clay layers. Can you end up with sort of deep waterlogging in those instances?
Yeah, you can. I mean, waterlogging's a risk in duplex soils anyway. I guess it just depends on how much of the water in finger flow accounts for all of the rain that falls and how much is still sitting on the surface. So if some of the water is still sitting on the surface and evaporates back into the atmosphere, then overall that probably reduces the waterlogging risk. But that water that passes down the channels and then hits the top of the B horizon and sits there, yes, that's going to contribute to waterlogging. So, but I don't think it exacerbates waterlogging worse than you would get if there was no water repellents. I think that was your question, wasn't it? Anyway, the consequences, I'm sure many of you have seen this patchy delayed germination. So you get reduced plant density, and obviously that reduces the overall growth, nutritional status, and final yield of the crop. Here's some drone images that were taken by Stan Sahaki. I think this one's down north of Kojonup on water repellent gravels, and you can see on the left large bare patches of a canola crop, and on the right just very patchy germination in every row. There's some plants that came up and others that didn't. Sometime later in the season, the canola, as we know, has great capacity for compensatory growth. So even if you get problems early in the season, it often does fill in, whereas the cereals don't have quite the same capacity to fill in the gaps, and you still left throughout the season with those bare patches. The origin of water repellents is organic compounds that are hydrophobic, that is, they're water repelling compounds, and they can come from the waxes eroded from plant leaves. They can come from decomposing organic matter in the soil. They can come from root exudates. They can come from fungal hyphae and their exudates. But broadly, organic matter in the soil can be, or the input of organic matter can be divided into two main groups of compounds. There are what we call non-polar compounds and polar compounds. And the non-polar compounds are carbon molecules that are uncharged, whereas the polar molecules have a charged functional group on them, which enables them to react with soil particles. Not all of the organic matter in soil is contributing to water repellents. It's generally only a small proportion. And from the chemistry that's been done, you end up with a group of so-called fatty acids and related compounds that are made up of about a chain of 16 to 36 carbon atoms, all bonded together to create this molecule. These are the ones that seem to be most powerful in terms of causing water repellence, but there's also some evidence that particles of undecomposed organic matter just sitting in the soil in pores may also contribute to the water repellence. And to understand water repellence, Simon prepared this nice diagram here, which talks about surface tension and water repellence. So I don't know how much chemistry you've done, but this is just trying to break it down into the key processes. So if you've got a water drop, and it could be sitting on a any hydrophobic surface, it will tend to bead up. And in that water droplet or bead, you've got lots of water molecules, and those water molecules are all weakly bonded to one another. And inside the water drop, all of those bonds and forces are balanced, and that's what gives the water drop almost a spherical appearance or spherical shape. Then you've got the water molecules that are right on the outer surface of that droplet. The molecular forces on them from one water molecule to another are not completely balanced. And that leads to what we call surface tension. And it's like a skin that forms on the surface of that water drop. And that skin helps to give the water drop its spherical shape. Now, if you put that water droplet onto a different surface, a hydrophilic surface, the water molecules now bond to the surface, and it flattens that water droplet out and spreads it out. And so in the soil, you've got some surfaces, such as surfaces of clays, which are very hydrophilic and have very high surface energy, and they bond to the water, they spread the water out, and they allow the water to infiltrate and move. But you also have some surfaces in soils, water repellent soils, that are hydrophobic. They have very little capacity to attract water molecules, and so the water molecules just sit on the surface. And of course, when we add wetting agents to soils, our aim is to shift to the left so that the surface tension is reduced and the water is then able to spread out and be absorbed into the soil. But anyone who's worked with water repellent soils knows that it's not stable. It keeps changing even during the season and from year to year. And this diagram here just tries to explain why that might be happening. So on the left-hand side, we've got a dry soil and a hydrophobic organic matter on the surface of the soil. So when the water droplet sits on the soil, it beads up. And that's because the organic matter on the surface of the clays and sand is organized in such a way that mostly it's the non-polar parts of the molecule that are sticking out and don't attract the water. At the other extreme, and this can happen in water repellent soils after they wet up, those molecules rearrange themselves, and the polar ends of the molecules are now more exposed, and so the water droplets are attracted to those. The surface tension breaks down and the water spreads evenly and soaks into the soil. So something can happen as the soils wet and as they dry out that causes rearrangement of these hydrophobic molecules to make them more or less repellent to water. And so that's our best understanding of why water repellence is most severe in the summer and the break of the season, but during winter and spring, after you've had persistent, repeated rainfall and wetting up of the soil, that water repellent behaviour disappears. When we measure water repellents, we can either measure the actual repellents in the field, or we can take the sample and bring it back to the lab, oven dry it, and then we measure water repellents, but that's really a potential water repellent. And there are various ways to do that. The sophisticated lab way of measuring it is to actually measure the angle on these water drops using sophisticated cameras and laboratory setup, but that's not very useful to most of us. What's most useful is to be able to measure it in the field. And of course, the water droplet penetration time test is the most commonly one that people use. So you just scrape away a little bit of the surface soil and you add some droplets and measure how long it takes for those droplets to infiltrate. The downside of that technique is that, those water droplets might stay on the surface for hours, and most of us don't have time to just sit around for hours watching water droplets. The other thing I would point out with this is that the water repellence is often greatest a few millimeters below the soil surface. So it's often better to scrape away a few millimeters of the surface soil before doing that test. The other way is what's called the MED, or Molarity of ethanol droplet test. So you make up ethanol solutions of different concentration, and so you start with water and see if it penetrates in less than 10 seconds. If it doesn't, then you try 1 molar ethanol, repeat. If it still doesn't soak in within 10 seconds, you go to 2 molar and so on, until you find the molarity of ethanol, which allows the droplet to soak in within 10 seconds. And that's the value that you give to water repellents. And we find in most water repellent soils, the value will come out between about 1.5 and 3.5 or 4. We know that water repellence is related to carbon, but there's no simple relationship between soil organic carbon and measurements of water repellents. Here's a bunch of different studies in different parts of the world, and some of them you can see there's not a bad relationship. The bottom left-hand one is from a large number of studies done in Western Australia by Richard Harper. I think this was down in the Germination area, where they found no relationship there between water repellents and organic carbon. And the reason for that is that it's not all of the organic matter that's causing water repellents. It's just a portion of the organic matter. And obviously it's related to the outermost layer of organic matter and the balance of these polar and non-polar compounds. It's most commonly a problem where the clay content is less than 5%. But studies suggest that only a few percent of the sand grains need to be coated with water repelling organic matter to stop easy infiltration of water. And that's represented in this diagram on the right-hand side, where the closed circles, the dark circles, are supposed to represent sand grains that are coated with water repellent organic matter. And just a few % of that is enough to stop or to alter the rate at which water will infiltrate and move into the soil. You can get water repellents in clay soils, but most commonly it's in the sandy soils. Microbial activity in the soil can have both positive and negative effects. So fairy rings, the outer edge of those associated with the fungal hypha are often water repellent. On the other hand, there are wax degrading bacteria and actinomycetes that can decompose the hydrophobic compounds. And Margaret Roper from CSIRO showed that in the lab, she could culture those organisms and introduce them to hydrophobic soils and reduce the water repellents. But we haven't been able to translate that into a field amelioration or field inoculation test as yet. There's some suggestion from Margaret's work that liming increases the activity of these wax degrading bacteria, and that helps to ameliorate water repellents to some extent. Farming systems practices have an influence on the expression of water repellents. Dry sowing, there's pretty good evidence that increases the likelihood of water repellents affecting crop emergence. So this photograph here on the right-hand side from a GRDC publication shows the difference between a dry sown part of the field and a wet sown part of the field in terms of overall emergence. Now, there is a big shift towards dry sowing. About a third of grain crops in Western Australia now are dry sown. And also with climate change, we're getting weaker early season breaks. And so these are exacerbating the problems with water repellents. And with the dry sowing, it may be related also to tighter packing of the soil particles after dry sowing compared to wet sowing. It may be related to more of the seed being coated or surrounded by repellent soil when you do dry sowing. And that could come from backfilling behind knife points of water repellent soil around the seed to a greater extent than if the soil is moist. Over 30 years of research, various technologies have been evolved and developed to reduce the damage from water repellents. And we can broadly divide them into amelioration, which is changing the soil properties to remove repellents; mitigation, which is to reduce the symptoms, but not the underlying cause; and a third approach is avoidance. And on some farms, that's the approach that farmers have adopted. They've simply changed to a different land use, such as perennials, which don't suffer from the same problem with water repellents. So just going through some of those management techniques. For amelioration, there's deep soil cultivation, so mixing, inversion. It's either diluting the repellent's topsoil or burying it. And those soil cultivation treatments are often useful for other purposes. So they might be combined with alleviating compaction. They might be primarily to bury herbicide-resistant weeds, or they might be to help incorporate lime at the same time. So there's certainly a lot of deep soil cultivation happening in the West as a treatment of multiple constraints, including the water repellents. Clay addition is another. So this is trying to enrich the surface soil with clay to try and bring the clay content up to about 6%. So it's particularly for those really poor sands that have only a few percent clay in them. Where does the clay come from? Well, if the clays increase in the profile within the upper 30 or 40 centimetres, the spading, inversion, tillage or deep ripping will bring some clay up, which can be mixed in the topsoil. If the clay is consistently at about 30 to 60 centimetres, then delving is another way to bring the clay up. And otherwise, excavating a pit, removing the clay-rich subsoil, spreading it, and then incorporating it is a final way to do that. We estimate that in WA, probably 100,000 hectares of land's been treated with clay spreading. And I haven't seen recent stats on the areas that have been deep tilled or moldboard ploughed, but it's now quite a large area. And it all uses large machinery. Here's some photographs we took at the Want for Field Day at Bolgarts a few months back. These are different types of delvers. So they aim to get down to 60, 70, 80 centimetres, and they're designed to try and rip into clay and then drag that clay up so that it's closer to the surface and then can be mixed in the surface. There's also spaders. The name, I guess, comes from the fact that it looks like there's a whole series of spades that are attached to a rotating cylinder, and they basically just dig down and lift soil material up. They'll go down to 30 or 40 centimetres. Then there's the inversion ploughs, modified one way or moldboard ploughs. The claying operation. So on the right-hand side, this is from down at Esperance. In a paddock where the clay is 1.5 meters, 2 meters deep, they simply open up a pit, use scrapers to dig out the clay, and then spread it in a 200-300 meter radius around the pit, and then use spaders and other means to mix it and incorporate it. And if the paddock is very large, then they'll open up a series of different pits in order to treat the whole paddock. With any treatment like this, there are positives, but there are also risks. So if you're bringing up subsoil, the question is it benign or does it have hostile properties such as high pH, low pH, salinity, sodicity, aluminium toxicity, boron toxicity? With the clay, particularly clay spreading, there's now a lot of experience that shows that if you leave it at the surface or close to the surface, you may actually make the situation worse because it can result in surface sealing or crusting and hard setting. And that clay sitting on top of a sand means that if you get light rainfalls, the depth of the wetting is very shallow and most of that water is lost by evaporation. But you can test the clay to see what its properties are. Probably the main one is to test how much clay is in it. David Hall did a survey of pits where farmers had excavated clay to mix into sands, and some of the subsoils have up to 70% clay, so they're highly effective. Some of the pits, the subsoil only had 10% clay in it. So that was fairly useless. Most of the pits that he tested would have had in the order of 30 to 40% clay. And some of the clays contain reasonably high levels of potassium and sulfur in them, which have a significant nutritional benefit from the claying as well. With mitigation, so this is trying to alleviate the symptoms in a particular year. Wetting agents are the number one practice. Photograph on the right shows on a forest gravel down in the Great Southern, treated with wetting agent on the left and not on the right, and you can see quite a substantial difference in emergence. So the wetting agents are surfactants, or like detergents, that break down the surface tension to enable the rainfall to spread out and then infiltrate into the soil. Although I was at the one for field day and the Socoa people were talking about their products, and it sounds to me like they also have some water absorbing polymers in them. So they're not just breaking down surface tension, that some of the new products are actually water absorbing compounds to try and increase the infiltration and availability of water, particularly around the seed. With the wetting agents, the early work used blanket application and produced highly variable and unreliable responses. The current approach, partly for cost, is to band the wetting agent just close to the seed. And so far the research suggests that on the forest gravels, this is a pretty reliable technology, works 90% of the time, but it's not a reliable technology on deep sands, and the reasons are still not entirely clear. Steve Davies at Deeper Geraldton is the expert on all of that. Other approaches, no-till, particularly if you've got disc openers. This can be a way of preserving old root channels or biopores. And these biopores, the channels where the roots went last year, if you can keep them open, they do seem to allow deeper and more effective water penetration, even on highly repellent soils. So Margaret Roper and colleagues at CSIRO did some really convincing work on that. And the photographs here just show examples of that. So start of the season, on the right, the soil had been cultivated and the stubble burnt. And you can see when they watered that with the dye in the water, there's almost zero penetration. But in the no-till soil, you can see that there is penetration of the blue dye, and it's corresponding with where the previous year's crop went. And if you look more closely, you can see most of that water movement is in the old root channels. And so the photographs on the bottom just show later in the season, even after the crop has emerged, you can see infiltration in the old root channels as well as in the new root channels. All of this work was done with disc seeders. And the disc seeder, of course, causes less soil disturbance and preserves the biopores much better.
Sorry for interrupting, Richard. I find that last slide very interesting because we were talking about organic matter before and it perhaps possibly being an issue, but it's heartening, I guess, to see that even in that stubble retention paddock that it was still assisting with water infiltration.
Yeah.
And not necessarily.
Yep. I don't know what proportion of farmers would have disc openers. My guess is it's probably less than 20% because they are more expensive. And so not everyone's able to tap into that technology. Nevertheless, there is, with GPS guided steering, there's also plenty of field evidence that even with knife points, if you sow close to the row of the previous crop, then some of the water entry through the old root channels is still preserved and effective. And this photograph here, again, it's on a forest gravel from the Great Southern region, showing the difference between part of the field where they were able to sow almost on the row compared to off the row, affecting the success of canola emergence. Another mitigation approach is what's called furrow sowing. So you try to create reasonably significant furrows which allow water harvesting into the zone of soil around where the seed is sown and the fertilizer is placed. But the soil in the interrow on the ridges may remain fairly dry even for weeks and months into the season. But with this furrow sowing, the water harvesting enables you to get more even and faster germination. There are some issues there with nutrition and with herbicides and pathogens. So the local knowledge will probably tell you just what's the best way to create that sort of furrow sowing and whether it's going to be effective in your particular area. But Simon Yep, in his PhD research, showed that with this type of furrow sowing, the water harvesting effect, so long as you can get good germination, it places water and nutrients just right where the seed needs, and you can get a real boost in early crop vigor, even compared to using blanket wetting agents. The way of doing this water harvesting is with modifying knife points or the boots, particularly if they've got a wing on them. That wing helps to throw the water repellent soil onto the ridge so that in the furrow, the soil is water absorbing and therefore can capture the benefit of the water harvesting. Paired road seeding is a sort of a variation on that. The press wheels are useful because they help to stabilize the furrow to maximize the water harvesting. And now a lot of farmers are putting a banding agent in the sowing row behind the press wheel as a way of trying to get the beneficial effect of the banded wetting agent, as well as reducing the cost of the amount of wetting agent needed. So there's pretty good experimental evidence. Here's from some pretty sandy soils, Badgingarra and at Bala, showing the benefits from the winged points in terms of plant establishment. The photograph on the right, I think, is a fairly persuasive case that if you can get that right, there's big benefits from that, the water harvesting effect of the winged boots. And here's some more photographs from GRDC publications, again showing big boost in plant density and evenness of the crop. However, it's not a foolproof technology, and I was involved in some work down at Esperance that David Hall of DPERD ran experiments down there where the winged boots really had no significant effect over 5 successive years on a sandy water repellent soil. So it's not a foolproof technology, but there's certainly people making it work out there. So just to wrap up, because this wasn't meant to be a long presentation, water repellents has been and remains a significant constraint to crop and pasture production. We expect with the changes in climate that we're getting, it's likely to be a more severe problem in future. Over time, various amelioration and mitigation strategies have been developed and with varying degrees of effectiveness. And some of them are more universally effective than others. Some are more specific to particular locations and soil types. And a lot of this learning has come through collaborative research led by DPIRD, Steve Davies and his team, with contributions from other people, including our work at Murdoch and CSIRO. So that's all I wanted to share, but Felicity, you've got the PowerPoint file and there's a few references listed there. So if anyone would like to do a bit more reading, those are some suggested places to look. So happy to answer questions or take part in further discussion on that, but that's just the, if you like, the basics of what we understand about water repellents.
Thanks, Richard. There aren't any questions in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourselves and or turn on your videos and ask Richard some questions. I've written down a couple, so perhaps I don't want to take the thunder of other people, but perhaps while they're getting themselves organised, to unmute and turn their videos on. Just in regards to testing, Richard, is it worthwhile sending to labs to do? Are there any labs doing water repellency tests, or are the in-field tests sort of the best bet?
CSBP will do a test, but look, I think it's you can do it in the field, and most people are aware of their water repellents and which areas. Probably the main thing I would suggest is that just scrape a few millimeters of soil off the surface, because the water repellents is often greatest in that sort of 2 to 10 millimeter below the surface zone.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks.
But I guess with the doing the water repellents test, probably a good idea to make sure you've got good quality water,
Okay.
so that it's, you know, it's not brackish, salty, or inadvertently has some detergent or anything else mixed in it, or clay or muddy water. All of those things could give you a incorrect result. But look, there's a lot of soil testing which you can't do in real time in the field, and you have to pay for it. But this is one where you can do it yourself by observation. So why not take advantage of free soil testing? And I guess as more and more people have access to drones, it just probably gives them the ability to look at a whole paddock and see the distribution, whereas I guess we all tend to drive into a paddock, park near the gate, and then walk a few meters into the paddock and do our soil testing and assessment there. And it'd be better to have a look over the whole field to get a clearer sense of where the real problems are, and also how persistent they are from year to year.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Peter, did you have a question? Or you just...
Yeah, no, not really.
So Peter, you've probably got more experience with pastures and water repellents than I do, so be interested in your comments there about how common, how severe, and what people are doing in the pasture setting.
Yeah, I think we've definitely got water repellent soils, but yeah, it probably doesn't have as much impact on germination. Although having said that, you know, I mean, the pastures are infested with capeweed, so, you know, maybe it is a case of, you know, areas not really establishing and the weeds getting in there because every pasture is, you know, full of capeweed. So yeah, that could be a bad outcome of it. Yeah, we found that we tested soils, and you know, I think a lot of it was water repellent, and but yeah, nobody was really doing a lot. There was one bloke was using the Lure H2O, and he was seeing effects. We gave it a bit of a test, and we didn't really see much of an impact, but that was on one soil type, which I think had a lot of other constraints. So yeah, no, I probably can't.
Yeah, I guess with pastures, you always have the benefit of those biopores, the old root channels from previous years. And so, yeah, the capeweed's an interesting one because, you know, what's cause and what's effect. Obviously, a capeweed with its big taproot probably leaves a very effective biopore, which allows soaking and infiltration, and probably gives the next generation of capeweed a head start in terms of getting established in that area, wetting up and getting away before other pasture species get away.
Yeah. And I know a seed producer down here has found chicory to be quite useful. I'm not sure if it was water repellents or what, but where he had areas of, I think from memory, you know, it was surface water and growing chicory in those areas. He said it just all drained away, and that's his sort of, he doesn't really like perennial pastures, but that's his favourite perennial pasture just because of the, whether it's compaction as well, you know, it might have a few different effects, but yeah, similar with the taproot, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess it is the case that we tend to have multiple soil constraints, and so where you've got water repellents, there are other things as well. So it's not just a matter of targeting the water repellents.
We've had a few pasture trials this year that we've done on water repellent soils as well. So we had one of our pasture trials that we moldboarded an area and sowed new pastures where there were cereal pastures or legume pastures as well. And you could definitely see the difference between an area that wasn't moldboarded compared to an area that was moldboarded. And we also have started looking at doing moldboarding or plozza ploughing prior to sowing perennials, because the impact on the perennials is actually quite large with a non-wetting, because you have perennials growing, but they won't actually have an annual in there as well that will grow during the winter period. So with the moldboarding or a plozza ploughing, you can actually have annuals growing through your perennials, and you get the summer use of a perennial and the winter use of an annual in that paddock.
Yeah, that's great, Brianna. And what annuals are you trying to grow between your perennials?
So between the perennials, there's a lot of Ceradella that goes in. We've also started, there's a lot of growers starting to look at sowing a cereal just as a forage during the year. Grant Bain up at Walkaway does a lot of it. He sows cereals and will go through and harvest his cereals between his perennials as well.
Yep.
There's a lot more interest in it now because we've got a lot of cattle farmers down here from stations. So we are starting to look at different ways of incorporating annuals like the cereal forages, clover, Ceradellas more into our perennials as well, instead of just using them as a perennial, but giving them the option of something else.
Yeah, great. Okay, that sounds terrific. Nadine, are you there? Have you done any work? I imagine your area might have a few non-wetting soils too.
Not really so much.
No? Okay.
Where we are, if there is, it's tiny little patches. The soils are mainly loams or clays. There's a bit of sand, but it's not a big issue.
Yep.
Previously, I'd worked with Steve Davies when I was working somewhere else, and yeah, had a look at some of that stuff. It was interesting.
Yep. Yeah, great. Okay, now we seem to have lost Richard. His internet must have cut out on him, so we'll hopefully he'll come back at some stage. But I might just keep moving on. So I guess I'll just talk quickly about the paired paddock project. So I know, Peter, I had a bit of a chat to you about, and you were interested in packaging up something about hydrophobic soils. And I think also Marnie and Freya were talking about it as well. So I guess having had Richard's talk about hydrophobic soils, I'm still happy for you to go down that road or investigate that and either report back on something that's relevant to your area, or have a chat to Marnie and Freya about what they were thinking of presenting in that space as well. So there might be bits of what Richard has said today that you think, well, that's something I want to investigate, and you could go a bit further down the track. So Richard's presented that with some great information about the different ways of dealing with those soil types, and maybe we could see some economic returns or cost benefit analysis and those sort of things. So I think there's still plenty of opportunity to drill a bit deeper if you wanted to go down that way.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about at that one for field day, Richard, was guys were interested to sort of find out, well, how do I find out, how do I best test how clayey my subsoil is? And we talked about just doing the hand test or the field test a bit, but yeah, there is also, I guess it's expensive, but I think it's about a $37 test to do a texture test as well. Yeah.
But again, I think that's something that you could just do in the field. I mean, it does take a bit of practice. I guess, Richard, you'd agree, you have to sort of do a few different to sort of get the idea that, yes, this one actually feels clayier than this one. So,
yeah, sorry, I dropped out.
Yeah, you noticed that. Did you get a better offer?
I guess even just getting them to compare, everybody has their own style, but even just doing a topsoil test and then doing a subsoil test, and that should tell you, well, obviously this one's a lot more clay than what the topsoil is.
Yeah, we had some, when we're out at the field day at Bulgate, was at Trevor Symes' place, and Trevor's been an innovator in soil amelioration, and so he's now done quite a bit of delving, claying, and his point was look first for the clay sources that are at the top of the hill, because it's much easier to cart a heavy load of clay down the hill than to try and cart it up the hill. And within a farm, the areas that have good clay and available clay probably are going to have similar composition of clay. So you probably don't need to do loads and loads of soil tests. If you do one, and then if you try and find other areas that are pretty similar to that, then you're probably in reasonably good shape in knowing what you're dealing with, and that it's benign clay and doesn't have any nasties in it.
Yeah. Before you dropped out, we were talking about cakeweed, and I was thinking when you were talking about the organic matter issues, or some of the issues with organic matter or organic carbon, are there some plants that can cause more hydrophobic issues than others? And has there been, like sometimes we know a wheat crop grows better after a canola crop or vice versa. Has there been that sort of farming system work done in regards to hydrophobic soils?
Yes. I decided not to show this slide, just in the interest of keeping it short. But yeah, this slide is at the end of the file. So this is from a international publication. So it's got a whole range of species that are of little interest to us. But yeah, there's definitely some species that appear to produce more water repellents than others. The eucalypts, of course, are fairly notorious in that regard. But the legumes do appear to produce more water repellent compounds in the soil than cereals. But I think there's local information as well from DPIRD that would be worth having a look at.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Richard. And yeah,